No spin, no bias, no censorship. I'm Dan Wootton. This is Outspoken episode 248, a special edition of the Uncancelled Interview coming up today before I am back live next week. But I am so excited to share this one with you because I promise you I have had more requests for me to interview him than anyone else since launching Outspoken nearly a year ago. I'm of course talking about the great Mark Steyn, my friend and former colleague in the primetime lineup at GB News, and where he would provide me with that incredible, bold and brave and certainly outspoken lead-in at 8 p.m. Now, Mark is genuinely a force of nature, the bravest broadcaster in the world by far. At GB News, he was the first to take the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs and vaccine injured into the mainstream. I was so inspired by his work every single night, and trust me, he made me such a better broadcaster as a result. His treatment by GB News was inhumane, and he opens up about this for the first time in this very special and rare interview recorded on board the Steyn At Sea cruise. I can't wait for you to see it. Just a programming note, there is no Uncancelled after show today because we have the special recorded edition of this show. But don't worry, it will return on Tuesday, so please sign up to watch on Substack, www.outspoken.live. But now, let's go.
Good morning. Don't worry, Mark is here. But I'm going to start today by turning the tables on the great man. You all want that, right? He's been asking the questions all week, so for one session only, I get to do that, and it's going to be fun. So this is the first time we have spoken at all in an interview format since Mark's departure from GB News, my departure from GB News. So we'll give you the real story for the first time. But please put your hands together. Welcome the great Mark Steyn.
Hey, Dan.
So you're here, Mark.
Great.
So, Mark, I thought it would be brilliant for us to talk for the first time about what really happened with GB News and the Ofcom, because, of course, that's how we got to know each other. And we were building something pretty special, actually, that I know you thought and I thought and hoped and prayed was going to change British broadcasting. Because for folk who don't know, the ecosystem in the UK is completely different to the rest of the world. We don't have a Fox News. We don't have a Sky News Australia. There's nothing that has provided balance in the broadcasting world. And for a while, it looked as if we were actually going to be able to make real change. And I know, for me, hosting that 9 o'clock show, because the story of GB News had been pretty horrendous before you came on board. Andrew Neil had hosted that 8 o'clock show for literally 10 days before he'd walked out the door. And actually, we were doing pretty brave things. And I used to watch your show every night back in the very, very dodgy, dirty, rat-infested, I'm not even joking, backstage area of GB News, and just feel, God, I can be brave because Mark Steyn is getting away with that. So I'm going to be able to say things that previously in an Ofcom-regulated environment would have been unthinkable. But after laughing at us, after mocking us, after treating us like the class clowns, what happened is that you were pushing at too many of these really, really touchy subjects. The vaccine, the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, even Angela Rayner's ginger growler. And as a result, what happened?
Well, I love being involved in new media startups, and I've been involved in a few in various countries. And so I thought that that our Australian boss at GB News might be like a Roger Ailes at Fox News. Roger was there were people who don't like him and all the rest of it, but Roger was a kind of genius,
Yes.
and he stood by his talent. So for the Americans here, Fox News basically had the same primetime lineup for 20. He made one mistake with Paula Zahn, who used to host, I think, the 10 o'clock show at GB News. And eventually they parted ways, and Roger's famous line was he could get better numbers with a dead ferret than with Paula Zahn. But otherwise, the lineup, Bill O'Reilly and Hannity and Combs, stayed the same for 20 years. And it's the complete opposite. The guy at GB News thought in the end that we were all dead ferrets, and that any dead ferret would do. And so he's got rid of the turnover of presenters there, because his whole thing is you can pull anybody off the street. And as you know, Dan, apart from the presenters, everything at GB News was totally dysfunctional. You know, you'd throw to a tape and it would never be there. I love the way the opening of the show, the opening of my show, the opening of your show, the opening of Nigel Farage's show was always the same. You'd hit the top of the hour and some presenter would come on and start mouthing, saying, and in the control room, everybody would be ordering their sandwiches. And so it would take, normally when that happens, when someone goes, people notice within, 0.4 of a second and go, and the voice starts. But on GB News, because they were all ordering their sandwiches in the control room, it would take, so the whole thing was, but I thought the lineup was just. I always loved throwing to you at 9 o'clock, because you're very professional, and so we'd have our little bit of banter and whatever. Whereas at the 8 o'clock handover, or Nigel would go to me, and I'd ask Nigel a question. And he'd be leaving for the pub, so he'd have ripped off his... And it just became clear to me in the end that they didn't actually want to be Fox News. They didn't want to... They didn't want to... Nigel... Flopper, I can't remember his real name now, but Floppadopoulos, as I came to call him, the Australian genius, and then Paul Marshall and the big Dubai hedge fund guys. I think they just wanted something that would buy them an in to powerful people in the establishment, so that they would... which is if you're extremely rich, then starting a TV station just so you can get a cabinet minister on the telephone is a good investment. But they didn't actually, the things I was interested in, and in fact I think I said to you, some guy had accused us of making a fuss about the victims of the COVID vaccines.
Yes.
And I said, I just noticed it and thought I'd like to talk about it. And I said, you did too. And I said something like, it doesn't speak well for the London media that it takes two colonial schlubs from New Zealand and Canada to want to talk about this issue.
Yeah.
And that's genuinely how I felt. Yeah. And there just came a point at which they wanted to become basically, I think, a suck-up to people that they thought were influential and important. And so I got replaced by the guy who had been Lord President. For the Americans here, you don't have this job in your government, but he was Lord President of His Majesty's Privy Council. We have one of those in Canada. I think in New Zealand you call it an executive council, but it's basically a privy council. And I don't see how you can be the people's. This is GB News, the People's Channel, and now it's the Lord President of His Majesty's Privy Council hour. I don't think that really works. I think there's a contradiction there. But maintaining an in with the establishment became super important to them.
Yes, well, I look back now, and I actually think we were used. So it's very interesting to me, because I remember in January 2023, I think it was then, we got the first hint that the management believed that Mark Steyn was pushing things a little bit too hard, that he was going to get us in trouble with the off-communists, as I came to brand them. But actually, I've never spoken about this before, but it was the opposite to what happened when myself and Lawrence Fox and Father Calvin Robinson lost our jobs and everyone just ran away thinking we don't want to lose ours. I was the complete opposite. So I arranged for Neil Oliver, Michelle Dewberry, and myself, with your permission, to go and speak to management and say, this will be an absolute disaster if you lose Mark Steyn. We've just done Victims of the Vax, which I think was probably the most important broadcast GB News has ever done. It was genuinely daring, and I mean, it sounds crazy to say, but no victim of the COVID vaccine had ever appeared on the mainstream media until they were on our shows, and then you brought them together for what was an incredible broadcast. And I actually think that is what tipped the balance with Ofcom. That's when they realized, actually, this guy is dangerous. And the management, rather than thinking this is the opportunity to double down and we're going to fight, I think quite despicably used a health crisis in order to make this change.
I think that's true. I mean, what was interesting to me was that this all happened. I had my first heart attack in London on Albanian National Day, which is now the biggest holiday in the United States. For the Americans, it's like and for the Canadians, it's the equivalent of 4th of July and Dominion Day combined. I mean, the streets are just full of Albanians celebrating their national holiday. And I had a heart attack that day that I didn't recognize as such. And so fortunately for me, I flew out of Heathrow to France, so I didn't have to be... We'd run all these stories where there's like an 87-year-old pensioner who falls down in the street and he's waiting 36 hours for an ambulance, which is what happens with the NHS. So instead I got on a plane to France and had my second worst heart attack there. So I was in the ICU in France for a week. And that's when GB News management thought, well, great, this is our chance to kill him, which I actually came to believe that they thought, this is perfect. We've been trying to figure out a way to get him off the air. And now we've got this great opportunity because he's in the hospital and he could die at any... And then we can do, it's with deep regret that Mark Steyn, he was so bold and courageous, but don't worry because we're going to replace him with the Lord President of His Majesty's Privy Council, and you really love that show. And I honestly think, and there's two things that I absolutely loathe about that time, is that Flopodopoulos, or whatever he's called, the CEO, had arranged, he called the hospital, gift shop in the lobby to send up a box of chocolates to me with this rather heartfelt message. So the guys from the gift shop assumed that Flopodopoulos and I were lovers. And so they read it out in this simperingly romantic, this guy who's he's determined to kill the show and as a bonus kill me. And they read it out as if it's a love letter and they're doing all this romantic pouting at me from the end of the bed. And then the other thing was that Nigel Farage wanted a medical statement from me that he could read out on his show. And I said, I don't do that. I said, my idea of a medical statement is from King George V. The king's life is drawing peacefully to a close. That's all the medical detail I want. So I didn't want to do that. So Farage then was in a fury. So he basically made up a medical statement. If you want your Ofcom investigations, there's one for you right there. You can just invent a medical statement and read it out. And at that point, I realized, they are... People always say, Paul Simon said this to me years ago, they say, people always say they want to be edgy and push the boundaries, but in the end, they never do.
Well, of course, because what actually was going on is they had been cucked and cowered by this pathetic, faceless quango run by a woman who was the worst executive at Sly News ever. Right. And they knew that they were going to find against you for 2 broadcasts, one with the brilliant Naomi Wolf, one where you were putting forward statistical facts about COVID, but they thought, okay, we're going to lose. What we need to do is show to the establishment that we're serious. We're going to listen to them. So we're actually going to give you Mark Steyn. And by giving you the head of Mark Steyn, they're going to leave us alone. And of course, the opposite happened. As soon as they had your head, they wanted my head, they wanted Lawrence Fox's head, they wanted Calvin Robinson's head. And actually, they want GB News' head, and that's what GB News never realized.
And absolutely.
It's capitulation.
And you have to pick, you should always take, you hear this all the time from conservatives and Republicans and so forth, it's not the hill to die on. Well, you don't, in the end, you don't get to choose your hill to die on. I was, just before I...
But it was the hill to die on too, come on. The deaths of hundreds of thousands of people was the hill to die on.
What I couldn't understand was that a fellow called Gareth Eve in the north of England, we tried to get him on the show because his late wife had been had been killed by the vaccine. Now, she's a BBC radio presenter on, a station in Lancashire or whatever. And she couldn't get, this is one of the things that I think is so awful. Jules Sirkin, who's on the cruise, had the same thing with Radio Kent. You've been in the media for years and you get sick. Your life is ruined because of the COVID vaccine. So you think, I'll wander into the Radio Kent newsroom or the Radio Lancashire newsroom or whatever. And these people who are friends of yours and whom you've worked with for, 20 years or whatever, they don't want to know about it. That's the story about Ofcom, that they basically impose a national lie on the entire country. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Belfast or Bognor, you're not allowed to tell the truth about what's happening.
Yes, and during COVID, remember, they had taken on all of these extra powers, special powers, which meant you were not even able to question these regulations from the World Health Organization, which we know now were complete baloney. Plastic masks, paper masks were...
it's incredible what happened in 2020, 2021. I said it was a national lie. It was basically an international lie across the entire Western world, where every country except Sweden mysteriously adopts the same idea. So for people who believe in global government, this was a great pilot program, and it totally didn't work. At a time when you need actually dozens and dozens of different views on things, there's this uniformity. And it was bad enough in America, but in a country like Britain, where a media regulator is basically given extraordinary powers to control what can and cannot be said on air, I think it proved a disaster. And I feel incredibly sorry for people like Jules and for Gareth Eve and for our other vaccine widows and vaccine injured. But I think they're not ever going to give real justice. And I certainly think that guys like Anthony Fauci, who knew on day one that this was one of his programs that had somehow managed to fly the coop that he was dealing with in Wuhan. But we had, the story of those years is not the shows you did or the shows I did. The story is all the people who were just happy to parrot. And again, I go back to like David Frost, who was as big as they get in television for most of his life. But I remember him saying to me in the 1990s when they started so-called independent television production in Britain, he said to me, we don't have an independent sector in this country. He goes, we have a dependent sector because all these people are dependent on that lady at Ofcom. Otherwise, you just don't get on the air. And that's totally unlike any real media environment in a truly free society.
Indeed. And so, all credit to you, despite these 2 heart attacks, despite GB News saying, no, we're going to capitulate, we're just going to accept this ruling. In fact, they released a statement saying, we take what the off-communists say very seriously. Terrible, Mark. Actually, we're now going to try and get Mark to pay any fines that the off-communists might put on our channel in the future, despite the fact that we're funded by billionaires. We're actually going to put it down to our individual presenter.
But first, if you're anything like me, you've spent so much time trying to find the perfect skincare treatments for your face, only to realise you've been neglecting the skin on your neck. But as I've got older, I've noticed that's a massive oversight because, of course, the neck is on display all the time, yet so many folk treat it as an afterthought in their routine. Now, so many women in our outspoken audience will know that the skin on your neck is thinner, more delicate and less oily than facial skin. But what that means is it requires specialised care. I have to say, I was totally blown away by this brilliant product, Go Pure Tighten and Lift Neck Cream. Absolutely beautiful product, transforming the necks of women and some men. I can say some men too, me included, all across the globe. It is such a gorgeous product, and I saw a noticeable difference actually within weeks, and I know it can become a game changer for you too. Check this out as well. Outspoken viewers and listeners get 25% off Go Pure using the code DAN at checkout. Just head to gopurebeauty.com/Dan. Use the code DAN, that's DAN, and you're all set. Now, Go Pure's proprietary firming complex designed to visibly firm and smooth the skin on your neck and chest in as little as 2 months. And in a consumer study, 100% of users said their skin actually looked more supple. 97% noticed a firmer appearance, which is obviously incredible. It's also dermatologist recommended and cruelty-free, which I know is very, very important for many other animal lovers out there. Plus, with over 1 million jars sold, I think we can say that this beauty secret is no longer really a secret anymore. So tighten, lift, and restore elasticity in your neck because your skincare routine shouldn't stop at your jawline. Let me remind you of this incredible deal for Outspoken viewers and listeners today. 25% off Go Pure using the code DAN at checkout. So just head to gopurebeauty.com/Dan. Use the code DAN, Dan, and you're all set. And after you buy, do us a favor. When they ask you where you heard about Go Pure, tell them it was after watching Outspoken. But now, back to the show.
Despite all of that, you say, bring it on, Ofcom, I'm taking you to court.
Yeah, because I just don't believe... In fact, I said it on air just before the end of one show, and you agreed. You came on, 90 seconds later, and you agreed with me. I don't think... I go back quite a long way with media regulators, back to... I think that it was the Independent Broadcasting Authority before Ofcom, and I remember the lady, somebody called Lady Plowden. By the way, when people talk about demographics that can threaten the stability of your nation, it's one thing to talk about, lots of Hispanics or lots of Muslims but the one thing no society wants is lots of baronesses, because these baronesses, one minute they I don't know how they do it, but like they breed like rabbits. One minute there's just like 3 or 4 baronesses. There's thousands of them chairing pointless inquiries into COVID, pointless inquiries into the grooming gangs and all the rest of it. But one of the first baronesses, somebody called Lady Plowden, came up and berated me in a restaurant once years ago for something I'd said on air. And that's all you had to worry about. You'd be having your shrimp cocktail and some baroness would come over and chew you out in a restaurant. But they weren't micro-regulating selected content of programs. And again, for the Americans, it's a totally bizarre concept. You imagine like Rush, who was on the air for 3 hours a day, every day for decades. You imagine if he's just sort of out one night at Palm Beach and some rogue baroness gets past the maitre d' and starts chewing him out for something he said on his show. There would be no Rush. There would be no Bill O'Reilly. There would be no Tucker. The idea of just picking out, it's a 3-hour show and there's 2 minutes of this, and you use that to destroy... And it didn't used to be true in Britain. It's not even true in that sense in Canada or most other Commonwealth countries, but it is true. They've just given them more and more powers over every aspect of media in the UK.
The irony, of course, is that for people who have followed along with the story, is that GB News never reclaimed the sort of ratings, the sort of social change, I guess the real army that we were building that ended after your departure. But GB News did quite belatedly decide, oh shit, Ofcom really do want to shut us down. We need to take them to court now.
Yeah, I mean, that was what was it. It would have been quite a good thing for a media organization to push back against Ofcom over what it did to honest coverage during the COVID years. And instead they find themselves, they then find themselves dragged into court because of something. Jacob Rees-Mogg did some breaking news about a Trump, one of the 147 court cases against Trump. And they didn't like, he was not supposed when he's acting as a newsreader to then add an editorial comment on it or something. And so they get basically it's the same people. It's just like the same people making these complaints about shows that and then you get dragged in by Ofcom. So their whole thing by the way, they had an Ofcom guy in the building, whatever his name was, the guy who was...
He used to run Sly News, just so everyone knows where he stands.
Yeah. And he'd been he was the guy the BBC called in to investigate why Jimmy Savile, who was a disc jockey at the BBC for half a century, in return for which... I mean, he just went after everything. He went after boys, girls. He went over dead people. I'm getting close to being Jimmy Savile's cup of tea. I'm basically another heart attack away from being Jimmy's. And yet nothing was ever done about it. And so they until this guy who became Ofcom's guy inside the building.
Yeah.
And
he didn't like me.
No.
He didn't like me.
No.
He actually, after about the first 2 weeks, he just stopped talking to me.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't understand that I said, I'm never going to play devil's advocate for the sake of it. That's not what I do. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, but the COVID vaccine is safe, or oh, but the authorities actually did really try to stop the Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs.
It's not just that it's safe, Dan. You have to say, oh, but we should emphasize that the COVID vaccine is 99.9999999% safe and efficacious, which isn't true. Yeah. But he was very... No, the thing that did for me with him was you start to realize it's just sabotage. We'd had a clip one day. I just put in a clip. I can't remember what it was for now, but it was from a Roger Moore era Bond film. So he's just cocking his eyebrow at Moneypenny and doing some double entendre about. I think it was it The Spy Who Loved Me, where he was M says, Bond's in Austria, tell him to pull out immediately. And Bond says, I'm sorry I'm late, something came up. And Ofcom guy said, you can't show this before the watershed in the UK.
Which you were.
Yeah,
I wasn't.
So, and I go, what do you want to... So I was furious about this. And I said... they showed it at 3:30 in the this film at 3:30 in the afternoon on ITV. You can, but eventually realize that, as with you and as with me, not with Nigel really, but with you and me, that the entire production and management of the station are just interested in sabotaging you.
Well, yes, and it's interesting what's happened with Nigel, though, because since our departures, because that's obviously the rest of the prime time gone, he has become all-powerful at GB News because they know they need him. At the same time, he is now a political party leader who tries to influence the coverage on GB News of issues like, for example, the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs. Nigel had promised an inquiry, which is now not going ahead, but Rupert Lowe, the Axe Reform MP, will be hosting that inquiry. But you have a situation where Nigel says, but you can't interview Rupert Lowe on GB News because this is my channel. So GB News has effectively now allowed a senior politician to take control of the editorial agenda of the station, which I would argue is equally as dangerous as anything that we ever did.
No, I think so too. You know, Flopodopoulos or whatever, I can't remember his real name, but when just before I joined, he said to me, what do you make of Nigel, who just started, I think, doing that show? and he goes, Nigel's very Marmitey. And I'd been in America so long, I didn't know what, because you can't get Marmite in America. I should give you a heads up for our UK and other Commonwealth cruises. So just remember that. You got to take your Marmite and smuggle it in if you're going to America. But so you couldn't get any. He said very Marmitey, and I didn't really. I just sort of went or something because I didn't know what it was. And it was my youngest kid who goes, "Oh, Dad, are you a total idiot?" Marmitey means, because Marmite is like the UK version of Vegemite in Australia. It's like people either like it or they really hate it. And so they were concerned that they couldn't build a network on Nigel alone. You had to have other people. And now it is basically Nigel alone. That's what it's come down to.
And so just finally, Mark, when we now look at where the broadcasting landscape sits in the United Kingdom, most people, and I would say for good reason after our experience, have given up on GB News. The off-communists now seem to want to regulate the internet. They want to stop independent broadcasters like us with lawfare, with potential regulation of big tech platforms so that they decide, so that YouTube decides, oh, well, Mark Steyn's too dangerous to allow on because we might get £1 billion fine. How do you think this is going to play out?
I think it's going to play out very badly for the internet because the internet has become a sort of cartel of so-called platforms. And the trouble is, there's like 200 countries in the world. So if you're one of these platforms, you simply can't, customize your content for, the United States and for Slovenia and for Uzbekistan and for Bhutan. So if you have a medium player like Ofcom presuming to regulate the internet, it becomes like a kind of it's much easier for somebody, wherever they happen to be sitting, in Los Angeles or Toronto or Berlin or whatever, to say, let's just take this guy off the air worldwide. And I think that's the world where effectively Ofcom will be able to make the internet worldwide increasingly as it is in China. That's my real fear. So in other words, a medium of liberation, which is what the internet was when it came up 25 years ago, where all these different voices just got out there in the world, has now been taken back and become just another instrument of control. And that's I think, where all this stuff is headed.
Yeah, it's chilling, and it's why GB News should have fought. But this has been very exciting. Thank you for letting me ask the questions. No. Thank you for making me a much braver broadcaster, because we had that sweet spot. I think we'll always have that 12 months. Do you know what I mean?
Dan was a great guy. I just around the time I joined GB News, Tim Rice wrote to me, the great lyricist of The Lion King and Evita and all the rest of it. And because Tim had been invited to go on your show, and he was astonished. He just sort of casually mentioned it to people in the pub or whatever, and all his pals had said, don't go on Dan Wootton's show. And Dan hosted a great show, and it was a privilege to be your warm-up act every night for that golden time.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you so much. But now I am going to hand back. I'm going to scuttle off. And I'm going to hand back
so the professional broadcaster is leaving the room, and it's amateur hour again.
Thank you so much for watching That's very special interview with Mark Steyn. Honestly, I'd tried for such a long time for him to sit down with me. He really doesn't do interviews these days. He's focusing on his health, but boy, oh boy, isn't he inspirational? What an incredible man. There's no Outspoken Uncancelled after show today, but it does return on Tuesday. So I would encourage you all to sign up to my Substack, www.outspoken.live. But we are back 5 p.m. UK time on Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific, midday Eastern. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Do hit subscribe right now if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble. And most importantly, I promise to keep fighting for you.